today. Okay, I just wanted to start with, I'm going to talk in three parts really. The first part I want to say a little bit about some kind of premises, I guess, where I'm coming from, where people who work in the field of evidence-based policy practice evaluation are coming from. Secondly, I'll say a little bit about standards of evidence, and there are various types of standards of evidence. I want to give a sense of what some of the commonalities are, but also what some of the differences are, just to kind of orientate you. And then lastly, I'll just make a few brief observations and then look forward to some discussion later on. So here are some premises. This is where I would say I'm coming from. We want to improve young people's well-being. In particular, we want to improve their health and development. We take a fairly holistic view of that, I think. So, looking at young people's the quality of their relationships, whether with their peers or with grown-ups in their lives, their physical health, their mental health, things like drug and alcohol misuse, pro-social behaviour, antisocial behaviour, crime, all those kinds of things. Their educational development. So, a fairly rounded view of young people. I should say that I don't think this is obviously taken quite an outcome focus. I don't think this is the only focus we have to take. I think there are other things that are important as well. We should be thinking about young people's about their rights, about their participation in various spheres of life, about their quality of life, about their happiness and so on. Some of those things are probably separate to an outcomes framework, but if we're thinking an outcomes framework, what I said is relevant. I should say as well, this is not just about fixing problems, this is about prevention as well, and prevention not just in the sense of preventing bad things from happening, but also prevention in the sense of people increasingly use the word promotion as well, so promoting good things. But of course there are young people who develop difficulties in various areas of their lives, and we are interested in intervening early to address those. Early, not necessarily early in their lives, although it can be, but it might be early in the development of the problem. And of course, for some young people, difficulties develop to such an extent that some kind of treatment is needed. Secondly, we want to find out good ways of doing this. In other words, good ways of improving young people's well-being. And I guess this comes partly from a position of a recognition that we can do harm. So I guess I should have perhaps even said here, we want to find out ways of not harming young people in the first place, but we also want to find out ways of improving their well-being. Some of you will be familiar with, the best known example of this is a program called Scared Straight. Anyone here know the program called Scared Straight? Few people do. So Scared Straight is a program that is widely used in America, and it basically involves taking young people who have behaviour problems, who may be getting involved in crime in particular, taking them to a prison. And the idea is if you take these kids to prison, they'll see how awful prison is, and they won't want to. They'll go straight. You'll scare them straight, and they'll go off their life of crime. And people thought this was a great idea, and it was widely used, and it's still fairly widely used in America. However, there are now several randomised trials showing not only do young people who participate in this programme not benefit, but actually they have higher levels of crime and antisocial behaviour than similar young people who don't get the programme. So we have this capacity to do harm, and medical trials tell us that as well. So partly for ethical reasons, partly for issues that some of which we've discussed already, that kind of public accountability, and also just because we have the young people's well-being at heart, we want to improve. We want to find out good ways of improving their well-being. Thirdly, that there are various ways of seeking to improve young people's well-being, of which programmes are one. So the Allen Review has already been mentioned by Janet, and that's the first Allen Review talks about a whole series of programmes. I can't remember how many there were, 70, 80, 90 or so, different programmes. The programme being a discrete intervention, a kind of often packaged, typically with some kind of manual that says to the person who delivers it, this is what you need to do in roughly this order in order to deliver the service. It might be a mentoring service, it might be some kind of school-based curriculum, it might be some kind of therapy, They vary, the manuals vary in terms of their level of detail, but it's basically saying this is how you deliver the intervention. There's varying degrees of flexibility built into that, so that it's not saying to the practitioner you just got to read this out, but there's some are stricter than others. So programs are one form of intervention, but of course there are others as well. Policies, clearly, anyone who works in the field of evidence-based programs is categorically not saying policies that would make for a more equal society are not important. I think most people would think that's actually critical. And programs will always be swimming against the tide unless we have those kinds of things. Then of course there are practices and processes as well. So programs are one form, and I'm going to talk particularly about programs. When I say the standards of evidence, I talk about very much within an outcomes framework and within a program framework as well. So if you're not interested in outcomes and you're not interested in programs, these standards are probably not for you. Some more premises then. We also, I think, want to know what it takes to deliver a programme and if we can do that. So there are lots of programmes on the market and lots of evaluations in the literature, but the question for a commissioner in a local authority would normally be, well, what does it take to deliver that? What are the human resource requirements? How much does it cost? Is there a manual? Is there training, etc.? It's kind of lift it off the shelf and deliver that intervention. So the standards I'm going to talk about cover that as well. And also a reflection for the person, the commissioner. Can we do that? Do we have the staff with the required skills in order to be able to deliver this particular intervention? Next, we want to know how something works and not just if it works. It's kind of interesting to know if for example, a mentoring intervention works in the sense of improving young people's behaviour or improving their peer relations. That's kind of interesting. It's much more interesting to know why that happens. In other words, to kind of people think about it in terms of a black box. We want to peer inside the black box and see what is it about connecting a mentor with a young person that means that young person's behaviour or emotional well-being or whatever improves. It kind of gets a little bit of what Jan was saying about a logic model. What we want to do is see if there is a logic model, if there is some theory of change, and that's been articulated. I would argue that most interventions have some theory of change. It's just the question is whether they are articulated or not. But if you have one that is articulated, does it stand up when you test it? And we also need to think about whether what works there will work here. So a common criticism of evidence-based programs is that they've been developed in America. I often wonder if programs were developed in other countries, whether they have such resistance. I think there's something about America that puts people off. But it's been developed in, let's say, rural Pennsylvania, and we want to deliver it in inner city Birmingham. And it's been tested and found effective in rural Pennsylvania, and we want to deliver it in inner city Birmingham. We need to have a think about, is that going to work, and why might that not work, and what might we need to do? Might we need to adapt the program in some way? Almost certainly yes. Can we trust the results from that study? What if you've got studies from several countries across the world and they all show similar results in terms of effectiveness? Can we trust those? So those are questions we have to think about as well. And there's a few more premises. I think it is possible to work out whether or not something is effective. And arguably the best method for doing that would be the randomised controlled trial. Not because it's the only tool in the toolbox, but because if you want to find out if something is effective, it helps enormously if you have a comparison group. I can show you charts of studies where they've shown that, let's take a parenting intervention where the children of parents who get the parenting intervention, their behaviour gets better. So what do we conclude from that? Often people would conclude that parenting intervention was effective, the kids' behaviour got better. But then if I draw another line on the chart that shows you what happened to the behaviour of the control group, you see it goes exactly in the same direction. In other words, whether or not the kids' parents received the intervention made absolutely no difference. And there will be lots of studies like that. So there is value in having a comparison group. That's not to say to say that I say there is more than one tool in the toolbox, although some are better than others. So there are other ways of measuring impact on outcomes. I just don't think they are as strong. So you could just do a pre-post test like I've described. You could do some kind of, you could have a comparison group where it's not arrived at by randomisation. In other words, you take, let's say it's a school-based programme. You might say, well, we're going to test this intervention in these schools in Westminster, and we're going to compare it with similar schools in Nottingham, let's say, that aren't getting the intervention. You could do that. It's just not as powerful. And of course, the job of measuring impact is not the only important job that's been discussed already. It's really, we want to find out whether interventions reach the right people, do the people who get them like them, do the people who deliver them like delivery. So there are other important questions as well. So those are some premises. I'm going to say a little bit now about what standards usually cover. The first thing they usually cover is what is the intervention. This might sound a really obvious thing, but sometimes it's quite difficult to work out what an intervention is. And what would normally be covered here is things like, bearing in mind I'm talking about from an outcomes framework, what outcomes is the intervention trying to achieve? Is it trying to reduce antisocial behaviour? Is it trying to improve emotional well-being, etc.? What's the target group? Is this an intervention that's for everyone in a given age group? Or is it targeted at young people, at certain types of young people or children? Perhaps children who have elevated levels of difficulties, children who have certain risk factors in their lives, whether it's to do with their home environment, their neighbourhood, their socioeconomic circumstances, and so on. The question would be, what is the intervention? I said that manualised interventions tend to spell out in some detail what the intervention is. But in standards of evidence, we'd be interested in what does it actually involve? How long does it last? Where does it take place? Who delivers it? What's the content of sessions? Now, I recognise that there are some interventions where that will be more general than in other cases, but you want to have a fairly good sense of what the intervention is. We would also be interested in what is the theory of change underpinning the intervention, if such a theory has been articulated. In other words, what are the links in the chain? If we do this, then this will happen, and it will have these outcomes. The secondary thing that standards usually cover is what impact does the intervention have, and in other words, what impact does the intervention have on the outcomes of interest? So does it improve behaviour? Does it improve social emotional learning, and so on? And by how much? One of the things that we'd also be interested in is there any evidence that it has a harmful effect? And randomised trials will tell you that. I'll give you an example of scared straight. Thirdly, how confident can we be? How confident we can be in the results is another thing that standards usually cover. I've said already that, so for example with a randomised trial, just because something has a randomised trial doesn't mean it's good. There are good randomised trials and there are very bad randomised trials. They can be badly designed, they can be badly executed, they can be badly analysed, they can be badly written up. Such a study is of no value or little value. But you can also get very good trials that tell you that have been well designed, well executed, and so on. So the standards often would go into some detail about those kinds of things to try and, because what they're critically interested in is there bias here? Does the evaluation introduce bias? Human beings are very good at kidding ourselves that something works. People who did Scared Straight thought it worked. They thought it was a great program, and they kidding themselves. So a lot of standards, a lot of them are about trying to figure out is there a bias. The third thing they would normally look at is whether the intervention is read, and I've talked a bit about this already. There are other things like manual training, etc. There are, by my estimation, I'm not nerdy enough to keep a good track of this, but there are over 40 databases of evidence-based programs, or databases of programs, at least in English, and there will be more in other languages as well. Each of those will be underpinned by some standards of evidence. Now, sometimes those standards can be they might not be much more than a few lines, and sometimes they'll be a few pages long, but it's a little bit like reading a Which report. If you read a Which report about washing machines, there'll be something in that report that will tell you these are the tests we applied to judge whether the washing machines were any good. And that's the same with these kind of these databases, and I'll give you some examples in a moment. I've said as well that standards can vary, and I think they vary in 4 ways in particular. The first one, just very simply, is they vary a lot by subject area. So there are databases that only look at, for example, education programs. For example, the Best Evidence Encyclopedia only looks at education programs. Others look at violence prevention. Blueprints for Healthy Youth Development was developed in America in the light of the Columbine School Massacre. It was an academic at the local university that was commissioned by the government to set up to look at how do we prevent violence in schools by young people. So standards vary by the type of intervention. So some sets of standards, some databases will only look at parenting interventions, for example. The range of evidence covered by standards varies considerably, and this was partly reflected in the function of the standards. So to give you an example, I just mentioned blueprints. Blueprints is widely regarded as having the highest standard of evidence in terms of impact. The requirements to get on the blueprints database are very high. So blueprints has reviewed over 1,000 interventions, all of which I should say have randomised controlled trials. They only look at things that have got a randomised trial. And they've reviewed over 1,000. They've only approved 50, so they've only thought 50 are good enough to get on the database. In other words, there are 50 they are confident. The Blueprints board is confident enough in that they should be widely recommended, widely used. So Blueprints is kind of up here. Others would be much more Catholic in the standards they apply. So I think it's now defunct with the archivist there, the Centre for Excellence and Outcomes that developed a few years ago under the Labour government. They looked at anything. It almost barely had to have an evaluation. They would look at it, they would catalogue it. So their standards were kind of right down the other end. And then there are various shades of grey in between. And I think this relates to function. So I think standards can be about 2 things. One is they can be about telling us what are the best interventions today, what are the interventions that there's good evidence from various studies in various contexts that they are effective in achieving what they set out to achieve. That's a valid function. Another function is what can we learn about interesting fledgling innovations that might be worth investing some more money in because they seem to have something about them. And something like C4EO is much more about cataloguing that kind of innovation. And then lastly, the nature of the information provided. Some websites provide absolutely tons of information, they're quite academic, and others are much lighter. Some provide cost-benefit information. If that information has been gathered, they'll say if you invest X amount in this intervention, this is a predicted return. So that's how standards vary. And then I just want to make a few observations by way of conclusion, really. So firstly, I think this plurality is welcome. I think the fact there's not just one standard, so there's not one mother of standards. There are various standards. I think that's to be welcomed because I think for the reason I've stated that they serve different functions. I think that's helpful. I think there's also danger that too many standards can be confusing. I think we're entering that territory now. We entered that some time ago. So if I was a commissioner working in a local authority and I was confronted by 40 databases and programs, I wouldn't quite know where to look. The Early Intervention Foundation has tried to do something about that by trying to benchmark their standards against other standards of evidence by other databases. I think it's quite a helpful exercise. Thirdly, I think standards must be discriminating. In other words, I think if you take a given outcome, a given type of intervention, I think there are some things that are better than others. So if we take, let's say, parent training programs, there are lots of parent training programs around. Every children's centre in the country we go to, we'll be running some type of parent training intervention. They all look similar. There's a bunch of parents sitting around in a circle. There's someone at the front, they're looking at videos, etc. They've all got different names. But the evidence suggests that there are some very, very effective parent training interventions. Incredible Years is arguably best known, and in my view should be much more widely used than it is. There are other parent-training interventions that have not an ounce of evidence in their favour, and standards help us to discriminate between these things. At the same time, I think standards must be pragmatic. I gave the example earlier of the blueprints standards of evidence. Some people would say that standard's just far too high. Although it's worth reflecting on the fact that to get onto blueprints, the intervention only has to have one good RCT, one good randomised trial showing positive effects. That's considered too high a standard by some people in our field. As I say, only 50 things that make that standard. But I think that standards must be pragmatic. There are some people who would say the blueprint standard is too low, because blueprints does not require that the evaluator has to be independent of the intervention. In other words, if the developer of Incredible Years did a really good RCT of Incredible Years, blueprints wouldn't penalise that. Some people would say, well, we should penalise that because there's bias. If we did that, then frankly almost nothing would get approved, because a lot of interventions have been evaluated only by their developers. Next, I think standards must be dynamic. I think the standard should go up. So the example I've just given, we currently think blueprints is high, but blueprints only requires one good RCT of a positive impact. To me, that's not particularly convincing evidence. Just because an intervention has been tested and found effective in rural Pennsylvania, let's say, I'm sitting in a city of Birmingham. Am I convinced by that? Probably not. So I think standards need to change and go up. And then last comment is science only takes you so far, judgment is still needed. So I've been involved in the Blueprints panel as an observer, and I was involved in the Early Intervention Foundation evidence panel, looking at evidence about interventions. And what you quickly realise is however much detail the standards go into, and when an intervention gets assessed against those standards, at the end of the day, there's a group of you sitting around a table and you've got to make a decision about does this intervention meet the standards or not. And sometimes it's difficult to decide because you might have multiple studies showing both within the studies there are different results. Some things are effective, the intervention is effective on some outcomes but not others, or it's effective on some measures of an outcome but not other measures of an outcome. Or you've got several studies and they all show slightly different things. You've got to make some decision about what meets the standard and what doesn't. So human judgment is still important. Here are some sample program databases. These are just a handful. Investing in Children is one we run at Dartington, at the place I work. Best evidence I mentioned, that's the education one. Castle is about social and emotional learning. Child Trends is an American one. It's good if you want an overview of lots of interventions. Blueprints, like I said. Epicenter's quite unique because they focus on about 10 interventions only, and they provide some very nice visual theories of change of their interventions. NREP is a government one in America. Promising Practices, again, very eclectic, lots of interventions within it. If you want any more information, you can email me. Those are some websites we run at the centre I work.